Marie Soderberg, and I'm the director of the European Institute of Japanese Studies. I'm Swedish, but I will switch to English because I think there are some people in the audience who do not understand Swedish, and for you this is no problem. I'd like to introduce our next panel. We have Cecilia Ruthström-Ruin, who is the head of the Asia Pacific section at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We also have Frédéric, who is his own nowadays. Used to be a banker for Handelsbanken, but now you run your own advisory company and have really long experience in China. And I know that Cecilia has been stationed in Japan also, so are quite familiar also with Asia. And I suggest that the two of you get around 10 minutes each to start talking about Asia. And from Cecilia, I really want to know how you see the situation in Asia and how it affects Sweden.
Thank you so much. I still wonder if I should stand up because I feel with this thing in front of me doesn't look very polite. So I will stand here and then I can see you.
I moved the mic so that I can hear you.
So thank you very much, first of all, for the kind invitation. I'm really, really delighted to be here. Quite a few of you I know already, but many others I have not had the opportunity to interact with. This is really a very, very great opportunity indeed for me and also my colleagues in the Foreign Ministry, not least to get to know you and for networking. So therefore I would like to introduce my colleagues immediately. We have Lisbeth Helvin, who is a sort of not unknown in this building. Lisbeth you wrote your PhD, right? Yes. And who is actually an Asia expert. I have Christian Fogelström. Both my colleagues are working in the Southeast Asia section, but in the department we have three different sections, one for East Asia, one for Southeast, and one for South Asia. And we also have Sophie, who is an intern in the ministry here today. It is obviously very important for us to know all of you and what you're doing precisely because we need to understand where we are heading. We need to get a grip of the big picture. What we currently see in the big picture is, I'm happy to say, not at all different from what our speaker has just been pointing to. The main issues that we are focusing on in the Foreign Ministry and in the government offices are, of course, those that our speaker has already pointed to. But I'd like to just elaborate a little bit also on how we are working, and this can only be giving some examples because the agenda is really very, very huge. In my department, we are responsible for 38 countries, if I'm not mistaken. But this is by far the most heterogeneous region that we are dealing with in the Foreign Ministry. So, as you know, it's more than half the world's population. It's well beyond half the world's poor people. But at the same time, 95% of people in Asia are currently living in middle-income countries. So this is also the region, as the speaker has already pointed out, where we have seen this tremendous shift that we sometimes tend to forget. But 50 years ago, Asia was by far the poorest region in the world, had less than 1/4 of GDP per capita compared to Latin America. So this is, of course, important to keep in mind. We have seen this enormous development, but we now need to understand what are the next steps, what is ahead of us. So this is a very big region to deal with, and as the speaker has already pointed out, Sweden is obviously not the main player, but Sweden does have quite a lot of strengths and values which make us interesting to many of the countries in the region, and where we can see a good match actually between what we have to offer and what many are interested in. But in order to be successful, I fully agree, we can only do that if we find good ways of cooperating, and I would add not only in the Nordic context, but also very importantly as members of the European Union, because this is really our most important platform. So I will come back to that. But when it comes then to big and important developments, first of all, as I already mentioned, this tremendous economic growth that will continue as far as we can see in all the forecasts, and which is affecting the world in ways that we don't yet fully grasp, I believe. But this is definitely the case. In many of the areas which are extremely important to us and to the world, Asia is absolutely key. Our speaker has already mentioned climate change. Asia, without strong commitment and cooperation by the major Asian countries, there is absolutely no way that we can reach the commitments made in the Paris Accords. So in particular, China, India, and Indonesia absolutely have to be on board fully, and not only be on board politically committed, but also be able to implement in their national contexts these commitments. There is a very rapidly growing share of world energy consumption that we see in Asia, so this is changing a number of balances in the world. And China, India, and Japan together, they represented a couple of years ago 40% of the world greenhouse gas emissions. So these are sort of the numbers that we need to reflect on. At the same time, it's a region that is more affected by climate change than most other regions. So it's a region where very many countries are very prone to natural disasters. We can only mention Bangladesh, Myanmar, many others, but also the small island states. Because when we talk about a populous region, yes, indeed, we do have some of the most populated countries in the world, but we also have the smallest countries in the world. So the possibilities for these countries to cope with the challenges are really, really vastly different. On security, our speaker has already pointed to security issues as another area where Asia is playing an increasingly important role. And we also see that military expenditure, for instance, the Asia region is the one where military expenditure is rising most rapidly. Actually, Southeast Asia currently most rapidly increasing. The growing role of Asia in world economy, as I say, but notably China, of course, in the economic interactions with so many countries going far, far beyond the neighboring countries and having implications for globally, including for us. This is a trend that we are only seeing the beginning of, and we need to fully grasp and understand what implications to expect and how to relate to that. So just one figure on the military expenditure. The military expenditure in Asia Pacific rose by 5.6% only last year. So you can see this trend. It's a very, very rapidly growing trend. And the speaker already mentioned the South China Sea. About 1/3 of all global shipping is passing through that area. So that has an absolutely direct impact for Sweden as a trading nation. So many of the developments in this region have direct implications, but are not necessarily so much understood or well known. Another area which the foreign ministry is, of course, constantly observing very closely relates to human rights, rule of law, democracy. You may have noted that 2 weeks ago, the foreign ministry issued country reports on human rights, rule of law, and democracy for 135 countries. I can tell you this has been a major workload for the ministry to dig into. That, of course, includes a very large number of countries in this region. And this is very important for us. This is very important for most of our companies, for all our interactions, to closely observe the trends. And while we see some positive trends, unfortunately, we also see shrinking space for civil society. We see an increasingly difficult role for human rights defenders. We see labor rights being curtailed in a number of places. So these are among the areas where it's very important for us to understand developments and draw conclusions on how to act. So what does this mean for the foreign ministry, the government offices? And here I can only give you some few examples, because it is really very, very vast, and I will focus on the areas where we have a direct responsibility in the foreign ministry, first of all. And the perhaps most significant, the platform for all our interactions with this region is trade. And this is the region where we see most prospects and really potentially dramatic developments in terms of trade regimes. Some of you may be following EU negotiations, but currently we are in the final stages of the negotiations with Japan, which could have a tremendous impact. With several ASEAN countries, we are very, very far ahead, and this is a promising area that could have major impact on our interactions with this region as a whole. For Sweden, as a trading nation, more than 50% of our GDP in trade, this is key to what is happening in our own country, but it's also key for us to be able to build alliances with countries in order to promote free trade, in order to actually fight some of those protectionist tendencies that we see in some countries in the world. And we do find allies, and we do find that countries are also shifting. We recently had a visit from Vietnam. The speaker of Vietnam visited our parliament, and we also had opportunity for interactions in the foreign ministry. Vietnam, despite its regime, is actually one of the most free trade friendly countries in the world currently. And a close ally when it comes to liberalizing trade, for instance. But we can also see that in many of these areas, having a strong policy dialogue, and dialogue in many areas, including by researchers on what are actually the mechanisms, how do we create value, how do global value change, what opportunities do they bring, and could they bring to your countries. It has an impact on discussions in the countries with which we interact, and can then also influence prospects for achieving good trade deals. Secondly, I mean, the trade regime is one thing. Specific export promotion is sort of more business, close to business type of work, and that we engage in a lot. Through our different platforms in the foreign ministry, through our embassies, but also together with many different actors. And that also includes academia, I should really emphasize, and the academic community plays an important part. We have, of course, Business Sweden as our business promotion arm, semi-government, semi-private sector owned. We have chambers of commerce, but we have an increasing number of actors. We see that these are huge markets where, in order to be effective, we need to cooperate much better. So one thing that we have been launching over the past couple of years is clearer platforms, not only in the countries, but also here in Sweden, called Team Sweden, where we try to collect all the actors. So far, they have mostly been focused on different sectors. But this year we have now launched a Team Sweden China and a Team Sweden India. And among, for all our expert efforts, Only one additional country, Brazil, has a similar Team Sweden group around it, so that is an indication of how important, precisely how important this is. But I should also mention Southeast Asia as another region where we see that we definitely need to step up our efforts. Generally speaking, Sweden is a little bit lagging behind if we look at some comparable countries in our exports to Southeast Asia in particular. Very few people know that the next country for a state visit very soon, in a couple of weeks, that's Indonesia. I think everybody here will know that this is the third most populous country in the world, etc., etc. But it's not that very well known generally in Sweden. We need to focus efforts. Last year we did Sweden Southeast Asia Business Summit in Singapore, and that was one important step to raise awareness about the possibilities in this region. Given economic developments, given potentials for trade, this is obviously where we need to be. And as you may know, currently Swedish trade is 70% with our European neighbors, and only 11% goes to this region. So in order to catch growth, where we see that half of world's growth from to 2020 will be in this region, we need to step up our efforts. Linked to that are efforts that are also involving many actors to spread knowledge about Sweden. In many places we are not so well known. And this is a challenge when it comes to building relations, and also there close cooperation between all the actors is really extremely important. And the fifth point, coming back to the cooperation, focusing on how we can increase the role of the European Union in this region is of fundamental importance for Sweden, for our possibilities, and for the potential to promote all these other areas that I have mentioned. So I think I will run out of time unless I stop here, but just one final point. As you hear, I think there is a lot that we can do increasingly together. I think we need, for instance, to use all the different platforms we have to advocate views on the issues where we know that there is a shared concern. For instance, climate and sustainability. This is something that really goes into so many different areas. If we have good policy dialogues, if we have good discussions on procurement systems and explain that it's a very good idea to look at sustainability, to look at life cycle cost rather than cheapest bidder, that helps to change thinking and achieve more sustainable solutions, which can help us to both increase Swedish exports and achieve Paris climate goals, etc. So I think we need to cooperate. And then finally, I'm really happy to be here and to have this sort of gathering for us to be able to find you all. And you have to understand that in the ministry, Marie was kind enough and said that, yes, indeed, I've served in Japan. I have some research background, but not relating to Asia. And our organizations are, of course, organizations with rotation, where we have some few experts. Some of them are former colleagues of mine in this room, Lasse Varjö, Börje Ljunggren, but that's a minority. We don't have the resources to build up. It's not that the Asia department is full of Asia experts. It's full of diplomats who have knowledge about diplomatic tools. I just came back. I served as ambassador in Lithuania. This is how the foreign ministry is organized. And we work on very sort of often short time spans, policy processes are quick. This is why I'm very eager also to find ways to interact with you and discuss how can we best find ways to ensure that we can tap your knowledge, and that maybe you may be interested in what are the processes that are going on in the government offices. So I think I will stop there, and I'm sorry if I spoke too long. Thank you.
Frédéric, you want to stand up? Or?
Yeah, I can stand there. Yeah.
This is
What can I say that has not been said already? I think we're all in full agreement of the importance of having this kind of conference or having these kind of interactions. But let me start, as I often do when I talk about China and Asia, with a quote. And this I've used many times, so those of you who have heard it, you'll hear it again. Confucius once said, 知之为知之，不知为不知，是知也. That means if you know what you know, and if you know what you don't know, then you have achieved real wisdom. I think that should apply also when we look at Asia. Do we really know what we know and what we don't know about Asia? I'm not sure. I think there's a need to make an inventory on that. Because we live in filter bubbles, echo chambers, which I think hamper us in collectively optimizing the knowledge and experiences that we actually have in Sweden about Asia, in academia, in business, politics, cultural, media, etc., etc. And these filter bubbles or echo chambers, they coexist, but they don't cooperate, which they should do. So once again, of course, I'm repeating what has already been said. Sweden is extremely dependent on foreign trade, free trade, and investments with our GDP, more than 50% dependent on that. So it's absolutely imperative that we make sure that we are better than our competitors on an individual, corporate, or national level. It's as easy or as difficult as that. There are no simple shortcuts. And if we know what we don't know, then we better make sure that we start understanding what we have to know, but we don't know. I'm sounding like Donald Rumsfeld 13 years ago, but you get my drift. So yes, there are a lot of tensions in Asia between countries and inside different countries. Now we also have the added uncertainty after Trump became president in the United States. Bye-bye TTP. Great opportunity for China to introduce its equivalent, or sort of equivalent, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And what will happen to the Paris Climate Agreement? It's interesting to say, when Trump said that it's a Chinese hoax, climate change, then China was quick to remind Mr. Trump and his people that it was actually George Bush, or even earlier, Ronald Reagan, who first coined the phrase climate change. But for some people, facts are not that important, as we know. Trade frictions, trade wars, yes, they will absolutely, inevitably affect Sweden. Everyone will be affected. So I think it's good and it's great that EU and China, for instance, and EU with Japan and other countries who actually firmly believe in the necessity of having free trade continue to glue together, regardless of what the US will do under Trump. And of course, China is the big elephant or the big panda in the room. How will it affect, we've talked about the South China Sea, East China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Taiwan, Indochina, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, India, Myanmar, and so on and so forth. Those points are also, of course, very important. And we have people in Sweden who are doing research on these issues, but not always well known, not even among you people, that we have these kind of deep pockets of knowledge. Economic development, yes, it's been staggering, tremendous. When I grew up, it was made in Japan. Then we had made in Korea, made in the Republic of China, made in Hong Kong, plus Singapore, the NIC countries, the newly industrialized countries. Then you started to have China, they started from the late 1970s. You look at the sort of the wealth creation only by those five examples. The only noticeable example so far, and let's hope that changes, is North Korea. Let's hope that eventually we can add made in North Korea as something positive instead of what is happening or possibly happening in the near future. And of course, yes, there is competition. I mean, Asia as a continent, all those nations are there. I tend to call them benchmark fanatics. I mean, they benchmark themselves against other countries, against other people, against other companies. So, of course, they like to compete. They're forced to compete. But at the same time, I see a lot of possibilities, as the speaker said, and other people have said after. Sweden is, for many of these countries, actually, in certain cases, a role model. In other cases, an interesting reference for certain specific topics. Social reforms, solving banking crises, pension reforms, gender equality, transparency, efficiency, ESG-related issues, sustainability, innovation, technology, human rights, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And do we need to change and adapt? Well, I think we are, as always, as a nimble, quick-footed, small nation, we are continuously adapting. But this is sort of an interaction between us and other countries. It's not that we're becoming more Asian, but I mean, sort of, Asia is becoming a bit more Swedish also in the areas where they're cooperating with Sweden, wanting to learn how, like, I have my own experiences of having 17 years ago when China was starting to sort of reform its banking sector, and they were looking at which countries have had experiences of solving banking crises. Sweden was a very good example. A few years later, China was interested, and that was also from my own experience, pension reforms. What did Sweden do? And so on and so forth. So there are various areas actually that Sweden make a difference. We should be aware of that. That's another thing that maybe some of you are not aware of. So I think that the most important thing, I think, is a psychological thing in Sweden. We need to take the development in Asia seriously, because Asia is taking us seriously. If there's no sort of mutual respect in that, on that matter, then there might be a day when Asia has grown tired of us. They've been sort of sending buying signals to us for decades, and sometimes we're not sort of smart or nimble enough to pick up these signals and make use of them to our own benefit. That's also very important. And another thing which I often emphasize, maybe it has to do with Pax Americana and the Washington Consensus, that too often we tend to look at China and Asia with US glasses, which is not a shortcut, which actually complicates things sometimes. Because I think from my own experiences, having dealt with China, Greater China, Korea and Japan, that there's a great mutual respect. Of course, I respect a lot of knowledge that is emanating from the United States, but it's not that we don't know anything about these countries. So I think a combination of, extracting, my point is that we should always make sure that we extract, absorb, utilize the best knowledge about these countries, about the region, regardless of the source of origin. So, we need to have a closer relationship, open communication and cooperation between, once again, academia, business, politicians, culture, and other parts of society. And also we need to make an inventory, as I alluded at the beginning with my comments quoting Confucius, of what we know and what we don't know about Asia and Sweden. And only having done this exercise, or if we do it sort of continuously, then we know where to beef up certain capabilities. And we should have a plan and objectives on how to make sure that we remain relevant to Asia. China, Asia, all these Asian countries, even North Korea, are evolving. There's also always a risk that we look at Asia and these particular individual countries with old glasses, if I put it like that. That's also a risk, because if we do that, because I've heard that, and you've certainly also heard it from your Asian friends, but from Korean, from Japanese and Chinese friends, sometimes they wonder, what do you really know about us? We need to change that. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience. Please present yourself. Yes, 1 and 2. let's take 2 questions at a time. You start. Yes.
Okay. Hans Hegedal, historian from Linus University. I remember that in the 1990s we also had quite an euphoric idea about Asia. Sometimes there were books issued called things like Megatrends Asia and so on. And then came this terrible Asia crisis, the monetary crisis around 97, 98, which brought widespread misery in a number of Asian countries. So is there any risk that we can see the bubble burst in the same way, or is there preparedness for these kind of events today that would prevent these consequences of a sudden monetary plummeting? Maybe Frédéric can say something about that.
Well, I think.
Let's take another question
Yes,
also
yeah.
at the same time. Gabriel.
Gabriel Johnson, Korean Studies at Stockholm University. Human interaction between countries are affected by personalities and ethnocentrism. We are all affected by our own cultures, which becomes particularly evident when we meet people from different cultures. So I would like to ask Frédéric about the impact of these characteristics in contacts, particularly between Sweden and China, which I believe you know much more about than the other countries, since I think it's a crucial issue when we live in a world so characterized by interdependence.
Yeah. Okay, Asian crisis. Well, precisely because of the Asian crisis, I don't see there will be another Asian crisis. Because they learned, all these countries learned their lesson, including Thailand. At that time, there was imbalance between their foreign currency borrowing and the financial position of all these countries. They were over-leveraged. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, etc., etc. So they all sort of imploded. But because of that, look at, South Korea, which was really staggering, 1997, 1999, rescued by IMF. And Korean people even donated their gold teeth sort of to replenish the foreign reserves. Then they rose from the ashes. But there are bubbles. China is one example where you have an overstretched financial sector, which has been creating a lot of overcapacity, which in turn have created a lot of potential, dynamite, I would say. But that's insulary, the Chinese domestic economic problem. In other Asian countries, so far as I can see, once again, because of the Asian crisis, they're pretty sound nowadays. At that time, 20 years ago, they had limited foreign reserves. But nowadays, some of the biggest foreign reserves, with the exception of China, which is by far the biggest, then you have Japan, then you have Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, etc., among the top 10. So that is not, I think it wouldn't be because of economic reasons that there would be tensions in Asia. It's more because of geopolitical reasons, according to my view. And I think on Gabriel's question, I totally agree. It's very important that we know what we know and what we don't know when dealing bilaterally between Sweden and China. And you know that I've been saying this for many times, that I was a bit, I was questioning a bit what was happening 13, 14 years ago, for instance, giving two practical examples with Elf, Karlovy, Dragon Gate, or Kalmar projects, and some people in certain quarters didn't really do their homework, making sure, are these really the biggest industrialists from China, or are they really knowing what they're doing? And this will not be the last case. There will be more of these situations. Maybe you have heard about this big insurance company, Anbang, which has been extremely aggressively acquiring assets. For instance, they bought Waldorf Astoria in New York, 2014. And after that, Barack Obama decided to not use Waldorf Astoria. But that insurance company is very likely to implode. It's probably only a matter of time. And they've been harshly penalized by the China Insurance Regulatory Commission, etc., etc. They've been stopped from making new investments. At the same time, international press is not fully aware of that. They still think that, for instance, Wall Street Journal had these big articles about a certain Jared Kushner, related to a certain president of a certain country, wanting to make deals with Anbang, but luckily that deal was inhibited. So yes, stereotypes are there on both sides. But let's say that if they have a positive, if Asia and Asian nations have a positive stereotype view of Sweden, that's not bad. It makes us more interesting than we really are.
Can I just add to that one? I think it is also, in this area, it's very important for us not only to think bilaterally, but to ensure that we are building the norms-based systems and the transparency needed, which also needs EU cooperation. So we have, for instance, on the procurement side, when it comes to certain larger investments, the European Commission is playing a very important role, and just ensuring that we have a framework in place that can guarantee transparency, and in particular can assist when smaller member states, for instance, in the EU, is dealing with far bigger counterparts with not a lot of possibilities to have knowledge. Then it's really very important that we have those common systems in place and transparent mechanisms.
Yes, two very short ones because we're almost running out of time.
Jonas Frédéric, Stockholm University. Thank you for very, very interesting, insightful presentations. Something that comes in mind that we observe this area of the world with their differences. The tension lines going back to the Second World War between Japan and China. We see it in the borderlines of Vietnam, unsettled issues there, the small islands scattered around the marine and other things. Differences, but facing maybe a shift globally of US concerns. What about the dynamics of coherence in this region that deals with alliances, even North Korea, for example? So how is the balance between the non-coherence and the coherence?
It has to be very, very short. Yeah.
I totally, Rita University, Anna Bern, German, living and researching in Japan. I totally agree with your plea for taking Asia seriously. But maybe this includes also not just to look for deep knowledge, but also to avoid hunting of short-term trends and taking a long-term perspective. With regard to that, I'm a little bit sad to hear that there's no Team Japan. Of course, Japan is no big growth story, but I think the structural problems of Japan are so important that you can also learn from failures, has, I think, severe strategic impacts. And the other issue is when you do research in Japan, you're wondering that it's often said Japan and Asia, as Japan is not part of Asia. And today also, maybe it's not a deep thing, but China and Asia. Maybe the issue, the term Asia is a little bit problematic and too large to focus and to stay with all the demands you just raised.
So I'll let you both.
Thank you.
Answer.
And actually, I was misleading you. There is, of course, a Team Japan, because we have in every country a Team Sweden platform. So we have a very active Team Sweden working in Japan, bringing all the actors together. But what we are also realizing in Sweden is that there are limited capacities to what we can do at home. My department covers a very, very wide area, and we need to prioritize. And this is also where we then have seen where do we have more weaknesses, and actually we have weaknesses in our cooperation and larger needs in some of the areas that I mentioned so far, but that doesn't mean that we are not focusing on Japan. And I'm very glad that next year we are celebrating 150 years of diplomatic relations, and we have actually a very large number of activities planned, both here in Sweden, where the Japanese embassy is in lead, and in Japan. So I'm sure that some of you are already involved, but that's also a major focus. On the question of dynamics of coherence and integration, of course, there is not an answer to your questions. You can only perhaps reflect a little bit. And what I can observe are actually tendencies going in both directions. Perhaps the most important one going in the direction of integration is the ASEAN region and the increasing not only cooperation but economically. We can see how in particular Indonesia, of course, as the largest country, is increasingly trying to assume a role and try to achieve integration, and there they are looking at also Europe as an example. So this is an area where we have a lot to share. We can obviously see a need for better coherence and some kind of a regional security arrangement for the region as a whole, and not least East Asia, where that is badly needed. And China has recently, for instance, been pointing that out very, very clearly. So I think many could agree. I think that's already in the old Asia strategy that Börje Ljunggren led the work together with Lisbeth in '98, pointing to really the need for a regional security arrangement. But Sweden is not taking that decision. We can only share experiences.
Just quickly
half a minute.
on the coherence cohesion, I think in that respect it's sort of it's people-to-people contacts, it's business taking the lead rather than politics. If you look at, which I think has been very interesting, because I'm particularly focused on Greater China, South Korea, and a bit Japan, that CITIC Capital, one of the big sort of state-owned investment arms of China, is cooperated very closely with the Japanese trading house Itochu, who invested in CITIC Capital, and they do joint projects in Asia. I think we will see more of that. I see that also with Tencent, with Alibaba, etc. These Chinese IT behemoths working in a very non-political, non-sentimental way with Japanese companies, with South Korean partners, etc. So I think that is more comforting than sort of harsh rhetorics between nations. But having said that, at the same time, 10 seconds is that last weekend there was a meeting between China, Japan, and South Korea on financial stability. And also on free trade, because they all have a common destiny in wanting to promote and protect free trade, once again because of a certain orange-skinned guy in Washington.
Thank you very much. I think we will end here, and we give our speakers an applause.